Here we have my 1999 996. It's a February 1998 build. And honestly, over the course of its life, I've really done very little to it other than putting fresh oil changes to it, air filters and this, that, and the other. But now it's time for a major service. And this has been by far the largest project I've ever done on this car. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications by clicking on the bell icon and never miss a video. We've got lots of Porsche content coming your way. If you notice, the motor is out. This video is not going to show you how to take the motor out. There's plenty of opportunities for you to learn how to do that online, and we'll share with you a how-to sheet that we followed. But I do want to share with you a couple of things here that you might want to have handy. Believe it or not, taking the motor out of this 996, there were sleepless nights. I was really worried about how easy or how hard this was going to be. But really, we did it with the tools that I already had in the garage. And here are just some of the tools that I thought were, especially helpful for this job. And this is a hose clamp tool to remove the spring, my little motor power ratchet, and then these little claw feet wrench ends. Other than that, all the tools that we used to pull this motor was quite simple. Why did we pull the motor? Well, surely you could we're doing the biggest part of this upgrade or preventive maintenance package that we're doing is we're about to install the IMS solution, and we'll talk a little bit more of the details of that. We're also doing the chain ramps on it, and we have a video showing the deviation on the cams and why we chose to take the motor out. But again, some of this, a lot of people would argue that you could do it in the car. Sure you can, but just imagine every little thing that you're doing, you're gonna be doing it either on your back, in tight spaces. Here, we took the motor out, and I've gotta say, it wasn't as hard as I thought. So with that, I'm gonna bring Jake and Charles to just share with you some of the things that we're going to be doing over the next 2-3 days. You can stand right here.
Okay.
Charles. Now the motor is out now. So let's do this. Let's pull the car up, give us a little bit more room, and talk about what we're about to do. Maybe talk about the parts and such that you'll need, because you made a very good point of, yes, I asked you guys, I want to do the IMS solution on my car. I believe I want to do the chain ramps, and you put it perfectly. We are about to fix things that aren't broken.
Yet.
That's it, yet. So this is all about preventative maintenance, and it may look, and it is, major surgery, but after we've done all of this, that the hopes is 5, 10, whatever years of fairly trouble-free motoring.
Yeah, the whole idea here is that we're not going in with blinders on just to do the IMS. The whole idea is pulling the drivetrain out. It's much easier to work on, and then we can address everything that could possibly break, so that the next, like you said, 5, 10 years, all you're really worrying about is changing the oil, wiper blades, brakes, tires, and just driving the car and not having to worry about anything that could possibly strand you on the side of the road, or worse, cause a catastrophic failure.
And over the years, we've had pattern failures, things that people know are going to break. And then we also have the things that we don't really share a lot about, because constantly, Flat Six Innovations, I tear engines down. We see things that other people don't see because we see this engine every day. So over time, we've got our own set of pattern failures, which is the reason why you and I walked around this engine yesterday, and I kind of did that little cursory inspection, and in 5 minutes, I pointed out 3 things that we needed to get some more parts for based on what I saw.
Right. Let's talk about what's behind you, and this is probably a decision that you'll have to make when you drop your engine, is whether or not you're going to disconnect the AC lines.
So it's a personal preference thing. Obviously, people don't have an AC machine at home. Some shops don't even have the proper equipment to do that, and that means you really want to stay away from opening up the refrigerant system, if you will, to the environment, because you have to deplete that, then you have to recharge it later. Some people are just going to open it to the environment and let that do its damage, which is not a good thing to do, obviously. So in those cases, you want to leave this system sealed. So if you leave the AC compressor in the car, fight with it a little bit while the engine's coming out, Then you're able to leave it in the car and then do your work on the engine separately. And then when it goes back in, then you just kind of reconnect everything, put a couple of bolts back in, and you never opened your refrigerant up to the environment or to a machine. To me, that's less invasive and it gives less chances for a problem. Sometimes when you deplete the AC, you have leaks when you go back together with it because you've kind of went from a pressure to a vacuum on some of those parts, and O-rings and things like that will have an issue.
Disturbed it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I try to go less invasive, which is why I said let's leave it in the car. Now, Vu's car is a very early 1998 build, being a February car. I love these early 99s. If this car was sold in Europe, it would have been a 98 model car. And some of the 2000s and 01s, you don't have this opportunity because those have a fuel cooler incorporated with the air conditioning system, and you cannot do this. You can't leave the AC compressor in the car because you have to disconnect fuel lines that actually use the refrigerant to help cool the fuel. So this is one car that you can do this with. But some people with a 2000 or 01, they don't have this opportunity.
Well, let's show people what I did as I took some of the parts off. Now, doing this here at PCA is not ideal. Normally I'd be working at the house, but I do know that organization is key, especially for later when we put things back together. So I created sort of a lineup of all the parts in the order that I took it off. I baggied and also used a Sharpie to identify all the bolts and where they went. And this may sound silly, but make sure you use a Sharpie, because if you use a bad marker, that rubs off or will fade after a couple of days, or some people, they may take a couple of months to put their car back together. You don't want to find a bunch of bags that don't have labels on it. So use a Sharpie so it's permanent on there. But I've laid everything out. All this stuff is out of the way. And now over to Charles on all the parts that we got.
Okay, so this might look like it's overkill, all the parts that we're changing, and I'm gonna just point out a few items that maybe you wouldn't think that you need to change with a vehicle this age. Like we've already discussed, this car was built in '98. You can do the math. The car's an antique now. So rollers for the belt, easy to do while the engine's out. Other stuff, why fight with it? Exhaust clamps. Just buy brand new ones. It's a few dollars. Sure, you could probably fight with the old bolts and reuse the components, but you're better off just putting new stuff on. Here's some more clamps. Another thing that, hose clamps. Again, you could probably just fight with the old ones. Just spend the money, put brand new ones. Another thing, like we already discussed, we're gonna be doing the VarioCam ramps. But something that some people don't think about while you're doing this, you have to pull the timing chain off. You might as well put a new timing chain on for the 4th and 5th timing chains in a 5-chain engine, because you can. This is just a few dollars. Again, you could probably reuse the original ones, but it's just a few dollars and you'll be happier with the finished product.
All right, well, let's move over to the engine, because this is where 996 CSI class is about to start, as Jake walks around my 98,000 mile motor. And it was funny that when you first looked at it, you kind of honed in on a couple of wear items, and you figured out sort of the history of this motor with the way things had some rust on it, or you looked at some bolts of how this and that was replaced. So as you walk around, why don't you share with folks what we're going to be attacking and why we're attacking it?
Sure. So first off, you know, Vu's entire package here is pretty much untouched, and this is what I appreciate. Too many times we see engines that have been kind of patched up or molested or whatever you may call it, where the wrong people with the wrong tools have been working on things. This engine does not have that. We arguably, the engine may have never came out of the car. We don't know that. I mean, we know that you did the update to the IMS retrofit maybe, 10 years ago or something.
Yeah, but the motor didn't come out for that.
Didn't come out, but the gearbox did.
It
so
did, yeah.
I was walking around, you know, when you do this stuff every day and you have all your life, you can look at a bolt, see if it's been out, you know how it was from the factory, and you can kind of put the puzzle together. And that's what I did. So now I think what I want to do is just take you through some nomenclature, help you understand what things are on the engine, where they're located. So when you do take your car to a shop and they talk about the air oil separator and why that has several hours of labor involved, then you can understand where it is geographically on the engine and a little bit about what it does. So first off, some people will say, yep, well, they could have left the slave cylinder in the car. And yes, that's a decision that we all end up making when you're pulling the engine out of a car, or gearbox out of a car. I know based on experience that if you pop these out in the car and you try to leave the hose connected, a lot of times it breaks when you start to put it back in. So I said, let's go through the extra time of actually removing it with the gearbox so we can change the fluid and bleed it properly. So we have a pretty good chance of being able to save that original part. So again, it's a preference that the mechanic or the person doing the work is going to make. On a 997, I always am worried because it has more plastic parts and they tend to break more. So, of course, gearbox here, one thing that we're going to go over, there is a method of the madness when it comes to where the bolts are that attach the gearbox to the bell housing of the engine. There's different lengths of these bolts, and they have certain places they have to go. If you put them in the wrong place, we're going to show this when we actually separate the two, but if a long bolt goes into a short hole, you can actually break your engine block and render it useless and create a failure. And we've seen this happen over the years, typically from inexperience or from a shop that is trying to do the work too quickly, and they're using impact tools and they're just not paying attention. So that's a big deal. A lot of shops work on what they call a flat rate, so the quicker the mechanic can get the job done, the more money he makes so he can get to the next job. That breeds negligence and problems. So that's usually what happens when those bolts, you put the wrong bolt in the wrong hole, that can create an internal failure with this engine, and it can even break the exhaust camshaft, which I've seen happen.
So in this instance, what I've done in the past with a similar project is I'll take a piece of cardboard, sketch it out, I'll take this one here, mark it, and just make sure that it will go back exactly where I took it off.
Yeah, in my classes, I call that an indexing template. So, and it works really well. It's really hard to goof it up. And, as long as all the things stay where they belong, you can also say, hey, bolt number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and then it's X millimeters long. And then just kind of keep notes on that. So it's situational awareness with a lot of this. You've got to pay attention. And anytime you're doing work like this, I urge anybody, especially do-it-yourselfers, create your own resource material. You need to act like you can't Google it. You can't look at videos. You don't have a lifeline. Because in the early days, that's the way we had to learn about these because there was no information. It was just a big black box. So we created our own resource material and turned that into classes later on about these. But if you take pictures and you take video constantly, you can go back and you can reference that and you can at least see the way it was when you took it apart. I think these are critical things no matter what you're working on, something at home or a car.
Yep.
People that just hastily jump in there and take something apart, they're going to cause themselves trouble. So
and if you depend on the fact that, I'll remember, you're not going to remember, and something might come up and you might not get back to the project months later, man, you're really not going to remember.
That, or let's say somebody else has been working on this thing, and they did something that was wrong, and then you have a video or a picture of that, and then you do go on Google and you're like, well, it's supposed to be this way, mine was this way, which way is it supposed to be? So you can never have enough self-generated resource material when you're doing this. So we're going to obviously walk around this thing and take videos. We may even have to go back and look at the video we're capturing now when we're doing this process. I would not be a bit surprised with that. So over here, kind of down in this little nook here, this is the crankshaft position sensor. So this is one of those parts. It only has one little 5 millimeter bolt that holds it in place. One connector. It's a very easy part to change, even with the engine in the car. It's certainly easy to change with the engine out of the car, but this is something that can and will leave you on the side of the road. And especially the symptom of this one is if you go to the store and you go out to crank the car up and it's kind of hot and it doesn't want to start. Usually that's the way it starts. And then after the engine cools down some, then it will start up and it'll drive away. Sometimes if you pull up to a stop sign and the engine's hot, it'll just shut off. Best way to diagnose that is this is what provides a signal for the tachometer. So if your tach is acting erratically or it doesn't work at all, it has no signal from the crankshaft position sensor, and usually that's the way you diagnose that. I've been left on the side of the road.
That's funny that you mentioned that because I have that symptom.
Okay, well,
when it's really hot.
Yes.
When it's really hot, I come to a stop sign, and sometimes the car just it just dies.
And the tach needle will bounce.
Moves.
Yeah, and that's telling you it's got an erratic signal. Okay. So, and I've had that happen. Now, also to that effect, I was going to bring this up later, but I'm going to bring it up now. This is a cable-driven throttle body car. This is the only 996 that had a throttle cable, and people don't realize that not all 99s had that characteristic. The C4 in 99 was still drive-by-wire. Only the C2.
Only C2.
So this has an idle air regulator that's external on the throttle body, okay? And these fail. And this will also make it stall when you pull up to a traffic light or whatever the case may be. So if your tach acts weird, I would go crank position sensor. If it stalls like that, just idling, and the tach doesn't act weird, I would say the idle air regulator is starting to get old, but those are a hard part to find. Crank position sensor is an easy, cheap thing. I will say, you notice I've already spritzed this down with some penetrating oil.
Yep.
Because this little 5mm Allen right here can break off. And if that happens, especially if you've driven the car in the winter, then you have to start drilling that out, and you have nowhere to do that in the car. Sometimes the engine comes out to fix that. So, like we said earlier, every 20-minute job is 2 minutes away from becoming a 2-day job.
That was one of my biggest fears of taking the motor out. Was I wasn't scared of the process, but I was scared of things breaking that I wasn't anticipating and having to spend 2 hours on one bolt.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Yeah. But I mean, obviously, anything you do comes with a degree of risk. And you as a do-it-yourselfer, people have to agree to take that risk on. At the end of the day, they're saving themselves money, but they're also able to ensure the work is done the way that they want it done. And then they learn something, And to me, those things are kind of critical. So also over here in this area of the engine lies the air oil separator. It's the same place on a Boxster engine. There's a little bit of difference between a Boxster and a 996. The Boxster does not have a coolant line here. Only the 996 does. But basically it's the same part. It's got just a couple of hoses, and it's got a couple of bolts and a couple of clamps and a quick disconnect. And this is an area of pain and agony for a lot of people, because if this fails, it can cost you an engine. And the way that this happens is right now, this air oil separator chamber is physically connected to the internal portion of the engine, okay, down here. You can see there's a boot right here. And it also connects back on the back side of the crankcase down in here. Now, if you follow this hose, these hoses lead all the way up to the top of the intake plenum. So what you're seeing, this is air going into the engine, regulated by the throttle body, under high vacuum. So literally, the air oil separator, its job is to separate the air and the oil. It's an emissions component. Because remember back in the day, when you would drive down the road, you'd see black spots on the road, like when there was bumps in the road. That's because old cars had road draft tubes. And this was even pre-PCV, right? So you would have situations where oil would just escape and vapors would escape, and that goes in the environment. So air oil separators are a thing because they help to regulate that and kind of reprocess it. So the diaphragms that are located inside this are an item that can fail, and new ones can fail. We've seen new air oil separators fail because anything that's mechanical can fail. Doesn't matter if it's new or old. Sometimes the new one is not as proven as the old one. And if this fails, you actually have a total physical connection between the air induction going into your cylinders and the engine oil sump. So in that case, and I don't want to sound dramatic with this, but it would be akin to removing this hose and dumping oil straight down the intake while the engine's running.
Siphoning off the oil.
It's siphoning it out of the intake. So what happens is your oil goes out of the oil sump and it goes into the intake. Oil doesn't like to be compressed. Okay, so the compression ratio in these engines are 11, 12 to 1, according to which engine you're working on. And that compression ratio is trying to compress that air and fuel. If you have oil enter into that mix, things break.
Right, and that's why you also see cars that start to have bad AOSs, they just smoke like crazy.
And with an AOS, that's another whole video we need to do, but ultimately with an AOS, there's a lot of ways they can fail. And I tell people, if you don't have that one symptom that everybody else does, doesn't mean that your AOS is not failing. It just means that one of the other diaphragms in it is failing. So usually a predecessor to this failing is smoke at startup, okay? The other predecessor to this is a squealing sound. It only happens at idle. And this is a characteristic people do not understand or know that much about because it doesn't happen as frequently. And it only happens if the hole in the diaphragm occurs in a certain area of a certain diaphragm.
So it's essentially whistling.
It's whistling. So what the whistling is, it's not coming from here. It's because the crankcase manifold vacuum has elevated to a point that this is no longer regulating. So this typically likes to keep the crankcase vacuum around 5 inches of water column inside this system. But when that diaphragm fails, you have about 20 to 24 inches of vacuum in the intake. So you're taking that 20 to 24 and you're putting that back through the system and you're putting it in the crankcase. So what happens is it pulls air by the front engine seal or the rear main seal, and the seal reacts to that and it makes a fluttering sound that's a high-pitched whine or a squeal. It only happens at idle. Okay? So I've had people, a guy on a Facebook group the other day posted, I think I've got a belt tensioner going bad because I had this squealing sound and it only happens at idle. He said, but I pulled the belt off and it still does it. So I'm like, well, you probably have an AOS failing. Oh, but my shop said it's not failing. I said, okay, well, let's diagnose this. So crank the engine up and take the oil cap off. Air is going to follow the path of least resistance. He's like, I can't hardly take the oil cap off because it has 24 inches of vacuum on it. Okay? So he pries it off and the squealing sound goes away. Because now it's sucking air through the oil filler.
Right.
You see? So there are different ways air oil separator can fail, and the factory did not give us an actual lifespan on this. It's not like, hey, this is a 40,000 or a 60,000 mile thing or a 5-year thing. I tell people all the time, if you don't know if it's been done or not, then do it. And it is important that you use a genuine replacement for this, because we've seen people put brand new items that were not genuine on these engines and have a different symptom because the new part wasn't made correctly or whatever. And sometimes we'd even create crankcase pressure and blow the green plugs out of the cylinder head or eject a rear main seal.
Oh, wow.
So there are things like that can cause it to have other symptoms. I will say that there are some other aftermarket solutions that some individuals have come up with that are an option for you to use. And some of those, actually one of them is able to take this diaphragm and it moves it externally. So it moves it to the front of the engine. So when the diaphragm fails, you have direct access to it.
Easy to service.
So one of my customers used that. His AOS failed. He was operating his 4.4 liter M97 engine in Montana, and it was negative 22, and that heavy air pressure caused the diaphragm to fail. It was not that old. Luckily, it was a remote one, and he changed it in about 4 minutes for $18.
Oh, wow.
So there is a benefit to that. But that is an individual effort that one fella came up with to do that. So air oil separators, it's always a big point of contention. If you guys are going to buy a car, if it's had the AOS replaced, then you want to make sure it was a genuine one that was replaced, and you want to make sure it was done in the last 3 to 5 years at maximum, I would say.
Okay. Now, I know, some people like to modify their vehicles or say they track it and such. There's a motorsports version. Is it like a heavier duty version, or when should one consider something like that?
So the motorsports AOS, it has 2 vacuum chambers. This one only has 1. It has 2 vacuum chambers. So effectively, each chamber is going to see 50% as much load.
Okay.
I try to leave personal preference out of a video like this. I will just say that, like Charles and I were talking about earlier this morning, we do not know, and anybody that we know does not know exactly what engine the factory designed that part to fit. Because every engine we've ever fit one to, for every car, required some level of modification to make said part fit physically.
Okay.
So sometimes you have to cut and hack tubes. Research that before you do it, and don't just buy it because it says motorsports. Okay. That, to me, that's a critical thing. People that see an ad sometimes, and I tell people all the time, hey, fishing lures don't catch fish; they catch fishermen, right? With this, it sometimes a name can imply something, but you get really deep in a rabbit hole just trying to make it fit.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I will say I've had a few of them fail, but they do fail less frequently, but that's a little bit inaccurate because there's not a lot of them employed.
Right.
So, with these, every engine had one of these.
Yep.
And given enough time, this will fail. Now, this one's been changed, obviously, at some point because somebody's putting different clamps and things on it.
Yeah, this must have been changed before I owned the car, so this is at least 2004, 2005.
Okay. Yep. So it'll have a date code on it, a datum.
Okay,
so when we take it off, we'll be able to see.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit later about changing the conduits that are related to the positive crankcase ventilation system. One of them is here, and this sucker goes here all the way under the engine and all the way over to the bank 2 cylinder head.
Right here. And I can only imagine how difficult it would be to do all of this if the engine was still in the car.
Well, and the thing is, of course, there's always different schools of thought on it. My decision to tell you to pull the engine out of the car was knowing that we wanted to do a comprehensive job. We wanted to be able to check and confirm our work. And to me, the only way you do that is to have full access, unobstructed, to this being that you're working on. If you're in the car, half of your effort is going to be placed on just working in the car. The factory made this easy enough to drop the engine out, so let's take advantage of that.
Yeah. No,
and some of these things, I see people fight all the time. They ask for tech support, even guys that have come to my classes, they say, well, I did that with the engine in my car. And I'm like, how much time did you waste?
Yeah.
And certain things, let's say you're doing this in the car, even these intake boots, okay? I've had engines fail because somebody replaced an intake part here because they were changing their starter, okay, or changing the AOS. So just so you guys understand at home, if you're in the car, you have Damon's view with the camera, and you're looking in this direction, and if you're trying to get to the starter, which is back here, or the air oil separator, which is back here, you have a firewall here.
Yeah.
You have no access. So the way that you gain access to either of those two is by removing these center pieces. Now, the problem with that is what you're going to create when you do that, because you're going invasive, and these boots can get folded under because you have no access to see it. So when you go to install this, you can take that intake sealing boot and fold it over, and it will create a vacuum leak. So I saw an engine do that so long, it sucked dirty air.
Oh, no.
Okay? And it basically created foreign object debris inside the engine because of that. It sucked so much debris in it over a period of years. And it was because somebody actually did this modification, did an IPD, which is a great part for this.
But they installed it incorrectly.
But they installed it incorrectly because they didn't know what they didn't know. So to me, I want to confirm my repair. So if I was doing that in the car, then I would take a bore scope. And I would look at the bottom of these boots once I've done the job to make sure the boots are uniform all the way around and concentric in place, and the clamp is concentric, and it's placing load where it needs to. People, in a general sense, they want to assume that there's no problem. Well, when you do this like I do, then I assume there is a problem. I got to find it. So that's confirming your work. But that's the other downfall to working in the car, is you can't do as good of a job. It's harder for you physically and mentally, and because of that, and just the fact that you don't have access to things, it's tough. Okay, so moving on around here, while we got a little bit better light on this side, Vu actually replaced the coil packs a few years ago when he did some other work. Those are some coil packs that we made during that period of time. So we've since upgraded those a little bit, but those have been in service for what, 5 years, I guess? Or more, maybe.
Maybe.
So we'll check those when we pull them out because they got some miles on them. We are also going to be removing the camshaft covers and having direct access to the chain wear guides in those 4th and 5th timing chains. And in the video that Vu did as a predecessor to this, there was cam deviations checked and all that. Now, the way that I've trained the certified installers that we've got for the IMS solution is to always check that, because that's what determined and made sure we were going to pull this engine out of the car.
Right.
Because, you know, if he had good cam deviations and those wear pads had not been worn, then it would have been a little tougher to make that decision to drop the engine, because the procedure I came up with so many years ago to do the IMS work just requires the transmission to be dropped.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the variable valve timing wear pads we're going to be replacing. So just inside this cam cover where this little bump is here, these actually support, and they are responsible for changing the valve timing on the intake cam.
And the chains ride on this surface?
It does.
Yeah. So
now, when we take this apart, we'll go over that in that video, but you're going to notice these are a lot different color. And that's because the factory has upgraded these with a better material. So one of your cam deviations was around 10 degrees, right?
Correct.
Okay,
like
so
4 and 9 or something like that.
And this car only has 99,000 miles on it. Now, I will tell, and I told Vu this, I could tell that under your ownership, and probably the prior owner as well, the car was driven as a Porsche should be. And what that means is somebody didn't poke around using 6th gear at low RPM. They weren't in a lot of stop and go traffic all the time, because the people that have 10 degrees of wear pad deviation at lower mileage don't drive the car that way. They drive it too easy. And it puts more load on these adjusters because they're constantly changing.
Moving back and forth.
They're constantly changing. So that means that yours has operated less. So basically this goes through a change at around 2,200 RPM, and then again around 5,200. So during that range, things are kind of staying parked. Below that you have a setting, and above that you have a setting. But 22 and 52 is when the variable valve timing is coming in. Now, I will also say that is a trait specific to the 3.4 engine, and even the 2.5 Boxster, the 3.2 Boxster, all those that we call the 5-chain, which is we can throw a designation list up on the screen about which engines are 5-chain. If you guys have an 02 or later 996, or if you have a 997, you don't even have these parts we're talking about.
Oh, they don't have these?
They don't have those. So what they have is a 3-chain, and the 3-chain omits the timing chains completely that those guide. So they have different timing chains, a whole different system, and there's less wear parts inside of it. And therefore, if you have cam deviations in one of those 3-chain engines, it's a more severe situation, because usually that tells us that you're having a timing chain fail. So if you would have had like 8 or 10 degrees and this car was an 02, I'd be like, don't start it again. You got a chain stretching, you see, or a tensioner going bad if you're lucky, or maybe you got both. So that's a little bit of a difference between what makes these engines different is the fact that, this is early and it has parts the later ones do not have.
One of the questions you're going to have to ask yourself when you're doing an IMS bearing change is, do you want to do it with the engine in the car, or do you want to drop the engine and do it out of the car? So just to double check whether or not the chain ramps in this car need to be changed, what you can do, if you have a solution similar to this Durametric plug-in that goes to your OBD sensor, and then you run a software on your laptop, you can check exactly where your cam timing deviation is. So let's do that. So with the Durametric program, it's quite easy to use. You're just looking for your vehicle, 911, 996. If I had plugged it in earlier, the software sometimes also auto detects. So now that everything is connected, click OK. Once your software has connected to the car, what you'll want to do is go to the engine module folder and then go to actual values. Double click there. It's going to make a connection with the car, and you can take a look at the various values within your engine, keep scrolling down and you will see camshaft position 1. So let's check that. Camshaft position 2. So there you go, just like that. You now know your camshaft position deviation. Position 1 is at -2, position 2 is at -9. -6 is really the threshold. A lot of folks prefer that it's at -4. Once it gets to about -11, that's when you're going to find a check engine light appear inside your car. So as I suspected, after 99,000 miles, the chain ramps have worn to the point where they need replacing, and they're showing cam position deviation. And so if you were to just keep it the way it is, did your bearing change probably within, I don't know, 10,000 miles or so, you then have to make now the decision of whether or not you're going to drop the engine and or change the ramps.
Moving on around here, oil filler tube, right? So this one is a part that we're always going to replace during something like this. It's not an easy part to replace, and it's also not a hard part to replace. A lot of times you got to pull the alternator to get to it, because there's a couple of bolts that come down that hold it in place. And it can be kind of tough to do. Guys that have a 997, this is really tough to do. Oil filler tube's in the same location. Usually with a 997, you have to pull the alternator to be able to do it. But ultimately, if you end up pulling all of this off because you want to change those conduits and do a better job, and you want to change your starter, which we talked about, then it's a very easy job to do this. So we may have to make a decision very soon whether we want to take all this off the top and do what we did with the engine and just bite the bullet and do more work to make it easier, or do we want to leave this in place and fight with it? That's another personal decision that you have to make.
Pulleys.
Yeah, looking at the pulleys. So Vu, tell them what I noticed yesterday.
So you kind of looked into the soul of this motor and you figured out that there was some sort of time period where this car was parked for a while. And the reason being is you noticed this discoloration or rust right here, whereas here it wasn't. There's a very distinctive line, as you can see. And that was because the car was parked and sat outside for a couple of months, and that's when that happened.
And it was probably during the winter after you'd driven on one of these treated roadways.
Yep, and then you noticed the, I was spinning them to see if they had any problems, but you were looking at, there's actually a groove here for this one.
Yeah, well, because, you know, every part has a story to tell. So part of that situational awareness is making sure that things make sense, or I want to see what the backstory is. And a lot of times I'm not looking at that because of finding rust. I want to see if somebody else has been there. So years ago when we started all this, you know, we used to use the term virgin engines. They were all virgins because people were afraid to work on them. There was nobody doing what we did. Today, that couldn't be further from the truth because the cars are old. But back then, we would notice these things. Today, it's like, okay, who was here? What did they do? Did they put a wrong part on? You know, what do we need to be prepared to tell a customer about that was done wrong or the wrong part used? So the oil filler tube, people look at it like that can just cause an oil leak, right? I look at it like this can lead to a condition as severe as bore scoring, because this is directly related to the fueling of the engine. So the crankcase vacuum level plays
this would cause it to run rich if there's a leak.
Exactly, yes. And it's the same way on a Cayman or pretty much any of these cars. If it will leak oil, it will leak a lot more air. So any part that can leak oil will leak air. People don't realize that. There are also times it will leak air but not leak oil, just because one's a liquid and one's a gas, right? So if you have a known leak with this, we see people tape them up and do all kinds of things. Bite the bullet and change it, because even if you don't think that it's running up the air-fuel ratio and making the engine richer, it is. And it's also impacting the way that your air oil separator works, because think about it. The air oil separator is depending upon all of these systems to be sealed for it to do right and to regulate correctly. So yeah, oil filler tube is kind of a big deal to be such a simple part. Now, if you look down here, I can see that you've changed this connector at some time.
We did, because when we
Okay.
did this,
Yes.
that little plastic
Will
one,
break.
Like we literally just touched it. We didn't even lean on it. We touched it, and the plastic just snapped, and coolant went everywhere.
So the factory made these a little bit better. There's also billet aluminum replacements for this.
I think that's the billet aluminum one.
Yeah, yeah, it looks like it is. Some of them are shiny, some of them are not. So that's a part that
I would
Every-
say
you
definitely
can-
order that, because
yes,
it
you
will
can-
break.
and the thing is, the first Boxster I ever owned, that left me stranded on a Thanksgiving day because that broke.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I'd seen that, years and years ago. I just knew there was coolant pouring everywhere. I didn't know what it was, right? Belt rollers, again, these are the originals. You can tell by the part number on them. You can tell by the fact that they're metal. The newer replacements are plastic. They have better bearings in them today. I can't believe that yours still feel as good as they do, you know?
Yeah. So let me ask you, I've never changed them, so I'm assuming they're original. This is all metal. The replacement we got is nylon. So the new one may have a better bearing, but is there a concern that it's not metal anymore?
Well, yes and no. I don't like plastic stuff. I'm too old school. I like metal. You know, obviously the plastic was cheaper and easier to make.
Yeah.
So nobody knows what drives these decisions sometime. I will say that that is another product that I'm in development of, to make one that has an overkill bearing and still has
Still
a
have
metal
metal?
casing. Yes.
Yeah.
So just because these are failing so often now, and to me, this is another thing like the AOS. If you don't know if they've been done or not, do them. This is a total DIY. You know, those two are easy. This one's a little bit more of a chore because it has the tensioner built
tensioner,
into it.
yep.
But those two are very easy. Of these two, I've actually seen this one lock up before and break the crankcase because it bolts with one bolt directly into the crankcase, and you can see that.
Right, yep.
I've seen this one lock up and seize on the track, and the trauma from that rip a chunk of the crankcase out.
Ooh.
Doesn't happen a lot,
Yeah.
but it is worth mentioning that it can happen.
And it's super easy to do yourself.
Yeah, it's one bolt.
Yeah.
Very easy to do. Like I said, this one has a tensioner in it. This is the idler that has the tension for the belt. So it is a little bit tougher to do. But like all this stuff, there's a video out there on YouTube for all of it. You've already done your water pump, so we're going to omit that, right?
So here's an interesting thing. I've done my water pump. It has a little bit of a weep, and I did it with the engine in the car, obviously. So this time around, I ordered a gasket, and I think what we'll do is just pull it out, and then just put it back on with the gasket. Because I'm not, like here, I'm not fighting. When I was doing it in the car, like I was fighting to put a wrench everywhere, and I just feel like I didn't torque everything evenly, and maybe that's why it's weeping. So.
It's also another one of those things, like I told you about, you know, there are rules with a lot of this stuff. If you look at what the factory manuals say, you know, it'll say don't use a sealant on that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't follow the rules. So a lot of times, I'm going to do what I think is right. That's what makes it my work.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put sealant on that gasket. I'm not going to put
Just
a
a little
lot,
bit, just a
and
little
I'm
bit.
going to use a certain kind.
Okay.
But I'm not going to depend upon that gasket to do its job without a little bit of help.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why yours weeped.
Yeah.
You know? But some people would say, oh, that's not a proper protocol. To me, if it works, that's what I call a proper protocol.
Right. Okay.
So one good thing about these cars is hoses, okay? I mean, with a car even being like this one, 25 years old, the hoses, that's probably an original hose, okay? The hoses on this car for the cooling system are exceptional. They hardly ever fail. We're seeing radiators fail now because they're plastic, have plastic end caps on them. But these hoses, unless you have a condition like intermix, where you've got a cracked cylinder head or something's happened and you have literally gotten oil in your coolant, these hoses were never designed for petroleum to come into contact with them. So if you have intermix, it will attack these hoses in a few months, and it will render all 29 of them. Some cars have 29, some cars have 27. With the third radiator, I think they have 32. It will render all of them useless. And I've seen people that had intermix set in the car for a long time with a cracked head and have to change every hose in the car.
Because it ate from inside out.
Yes.
Wow.
And you can, I've had them, like this hose here, I've literally been able to take my fingers and peel it apart because the intermix attacked it. So anybody out there, if you've got a car that has intermix, you need to drain the cooling system as soon as you possibly can and get it preserved. And don't start the engine up again or it's going to intermix again. But you have just a matter of about 3 or 4 months before the hoses get to the point where you have to replace them all. And I haven't priced that job in a long time, but back when we used to do that work, it was about a $5,000 job back then.
Replacing all the.
Because there's so many hoses. The hoses aren't that expensive. The labor to go invasive and change every one of them all the way to the heater core is a big deal. And I've actually had one of these fail when I was dyno testing a car on my chassis dyno, and it almost took the engine out before I could shut it off. So if that hose fails, it blows all the coolant out, and even if you shut the engine off, it'll keep getting hotter because there's no coolant in it.
If you look inside this hose, I'm proud to say it seems like it's in great condition.
Yeah, the hoses, they did not skimp on hoses for these cars at all. I would trust those hoses. If they had no intermix, I would just trust them to this point indefinitely because I have not seen one fail in a normal scenario.
All right, how about this side of the motor?
Okay, so over here we have quite a few things. Some power steering hoses, which you fought a little bit in the car. You want to tell them your trick that you did with that?
Yeah, so when we were disconnecting the power steering hoses, I wasn't sure what spins, and this is where the crow's feet came in handy. And you can get a vice grip and hold this tight and then spin everything on this side, because the connector on this side actually spins. Because if you try to spin this side of it, then the hose is going to bind up and such. So that little made a little bit of a difference and came right out.
And again, on this side of the engine, you're fighting pretty hard because you have the X59 1 and 2 connectors over there that are kind of in your way. And these are just quick disconnects, and people don't really realize that they're that easy to come loose.
Yeah.
So you want to get those out of your way quick. But yeah, this is definitely one of the things that can cause you to have to use vice grips and things like that. It's also a point where some engines that are not virgin anymore, people have messed this up and they've done improvised repairs to make this right. They've cut hoses and done all kinds of things to do that.
Since we're up in this area, I think it'd be a good time to share with you what we showed you how we took the air compressor out. Front bolts were extremely easy to take off, but there was that one bolt. That one bolt that is buried, you can, Damon, look in here, buried in there.
And there's a spacer.
But there is a...
And this spacer comes out sometimes like that, see?
Yeah.
The bolt passes through that spacer.
Where's the temperature sensor?
Right here.
Okay, so this temperature sensor was here, and then this grommet pops out, and then with a proper socket and a swivel, you can guide, and you can put your hand down in here and feel that it sits properly onto the bolt, and then you can back it out. But without that little access hole and without a swivel, you're not going to get that bolt. So that was probably one of the toughest bolts to remove. But once that was out, then the air compressor slid right out.
I agree. I mean, that's always, when you're putting the engine back in, you're going to fight with it as well. And I will just say, when you go to do that, don't put any wrenches on it until you're able to turn it 2 or 3 turns by hand. Because you will very easily cross-thread it and have to start all over again if you put a wrench on it too soon.
Right.
So,
and keep in mind when it's in the car, the top of the lid is right here. So your hands are going to get a little bit of work.
And that's why I told you, get some of those 1/4-inch drive extensions, get some 1/4-inch drive swivel sockets. Those things come in handy. I've even sometimes taped that bolt onto that swivel socket.
That's exactly what I did. I taped it.
So there's little tricks like that. Again, create your own resource material as you're going. So over here, let's talk about this engine bay temperature sensor.
I taped it.
Yep.
Just so it doesn't...
So if any of you guys have a 996 or 1 or 2, even Boxsters will do the same thing. This engine bay temperature sensor actually clips right here inside the intake manifold with this boot, okay? And it has a little grommet that holds it in this location. If you've worked on this side, if you've changed the oil pressure sensor or something, you've disconnected those big connectors like these, then you can knock this loose. Or sometimes it'll just fall out by itself. And when it falls out, it falls down here somewhere, and it gets a lot of heat that it's not supposed to see. So then you'll notice the engine bay compartment fan will start coming on frequently or stay on until it runs the battery down, because this is so hot that it makes the engine or the ECU think that it's overheated the engine bay, because this is laying on a hot part.
Right.
And it'll give you a little picture of a fan on the display, and it will say failure engine compartment temperature. All you need to do is take this and put it right back where it belongs.
Yep.
That's all you have to do. That's a very common thing, but I'm sure people take cars to a shop for literally then to stick that back there. And sometimes the shop doesn't know that.
Oh. Now I know this is a part that I bought a few years ago. Now it's going to be super easy to do because the engine's out.
Yeah, so engine oil temperature or pressure sensor. So this is the original one, and this is another one of those parts I'll jump out on the limb and say if it hasn't been changed, change it, because they all go bad. So I see in Facebook groups all the time, a guy will post a picture and say, you know, my oil pressure went to 5 bar all the time and it stays there. Is there something wrong? Or my oil pressure gauge went to the bottom and it stays there. Or when my engine's hot, the gauge looks nervous at like 3 or 4 bar. All of those are symptoms of this.
And what does that affect when it's not correct?
Well, it really just affects the driver, right? Because you see it and you think something's wrong, because oil pressure is always an issue.
Right.
So I tell people, anytime you see anything with oil pressure, yes, you take it seriously. Like, you know, you don't assume you have a problem, or you don't assume you don't have a problem, you assume you do have a problem. So I would just say, if you see it go to 5 bar, there's nothing in the engine that's going to create more oil pressure than normal. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Now, sometimes I will say the oil pressure relief valve can stick, but it still won't drive it to 5 bar all the time. It'll drive it higher, but not all the time at 5 bar. But with this, typically I see that symptom is it gets really nervous, or it'll drop. Like you'll sit there and hold the engine at like 2,000 or 3,000 RPM while it's hot, and it will really dip up and down. So that's a problem all the time.
The reason why I bought it and I haven't put it on yet, because remember I told you how when it was really hot outside, I come to a stop sign, once in a while the engine would just kind of, it would fluctuate idle and then just drop and turn off, right? And then start back up and it's fine. And the needle would go a show down close to 0 when I come to a stop. So that's why I bought it.
Well, one reason for that, and I mean, this you can have compound issues. I think that's something very important we need to say in a video like this is, there's no rule that says that it's okay to just have one failure at a time. We see compound failures all the time. I've seen a guy that had a bad mass airflow sensor and a bad air oil separator at the same time, and the two cancel each other out, and the engine had no symptom until you change one of them. And then it has a symptom because both of them failed together. So there is no rhyme or reason for this. The engine does not have to ask permission to fail. You don't have to have permission for one part to fail. The only thing guaranteed about any engine or anything mechanical, that it will wear out if it does not fail first. As you know, working on aviation stuff, you learn that.
Right.
So this oil pressure sensor, again, if you haven't changed it, change it. It's an easy part to change. It just takes a couple of tools, and you have to sneak around in the engine bay. There's videos out there about how to change it. The main thing I'll say is just make sure you remember, when you unplug the wires, do not grab the wire and rip it out. Take the connector, and then one of these bolts on, okay? But it also has a spade. So you can remove the spade.
And this is going to be so much easier to do out here.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Everything that we're going to do is greatly simplified with this engine out of the car. And even now, I told you about the fuel injectors. So we are seeing fuel injectors have a problem. And people say, well, I'll have mine cleaned. Well, the problem is that a fuel injector, when it's made, it is a compound unit. And we are seeing injectors that aren't just dirty. Of course, an injector can get dirty. Modern fuels and all this stuff that go into it with a 25-year-old car, yes, that can be a thing. However, there is no replacement for replacing that part because it's mechanical on the inside. And once a factory put it together, you can't disassemble it the way that it's made. So we are seeing mechanical wear lead to injector issues, misfires, overfueling, which can not really lead to bore scoring, but add into it, and add into all sorts of things. It can make the exhaust gas temperatures run higher, especially on the track, all that. So injectors are something to always consider, especially when the car's 25 years old. And like we said, when we kind of titled this thing, you know, we're fixing what's not broken yet. That's the idea. But everybody at home, we have to have somewhere to stop. Like, you know, where do you stop replacing things? Even when I reconstruct an engine, where do I stop replacing things? And that has to be a decision the person makes based on their budget, the overall goal of how long they want to keep the car and what they're going to use it for. You know, to me, if you're going to use this car for something that you're going to take on a road trip, like when I decided I was going to drive my 996 up here, then I decided I wasn't going to. The reason why is because there's a couple of things on it that in my mind I knew needed to be done, and I didn't want to drive 12 hours with that in the back of my mind.
Right.
And I didn't have time to fix them.
Right. Now let's talk about this. Looks very simple, a ground strap.
Yeah, very simple ground strap. Of course, you know, here in the Baltimore area, Vu drives a car in the winter sometimes, and they use bad stuff on the roads, salty stuff.
Yep.
So this connector has got some surface corrosion on it. And this is what grounds the entire driveline. So if this ground is bad, the alternator's not going to charge well, the starter's not going to do its job well. You can have all kind of voltage-induced problems. I've seen people that basically put a car up for storage over the winter. They go to crank it, and all it does is click. Well, they replace the battery because the car is in storage. They replace this, they replace that. When the whole time, this had become corroded a little bit more setting over the winter, and it would not get a connection. We're also seeing these start to corrode on the inside. So they will turn green with corrosion on the inside of the cable, and then you have resistance go up. They don't do a good job grounding and things like that. So this is something, you know, you don't have to even buy this from the dealer. You don't have to buy it from anybody special. This is just a regular old ground strap. Make sure it's the right diameter, gauge, and you can grab one of those at a local parts store. Now, one thing I've learned to do, especially on 997s, is put a second one of these. So we go on the other cylinder head. There's a place that we can also bolt it to, and then I just bolt it to the same spot on the other side of the chassis. Of course, you have to have a longer cable, but to me, that gives another layer of grounding. Because if things in these cars don't have good grounds, they get very grumpy very quickly.
Right. Now I noticed you were squirting some penetrant on some bolts here. Are we taking this stuff off?
Well, so we're going to try to sneak some things off here. We want to leave the header pipes on. You know, this side is pretty tough to do this with. I've only been able to, I even tried to do it a few times. Usually I just pull this set of headers off on this side. The other side is very easy because the cylinder head is inverted on that side, so all the parts are on the back side of the engine. Here, we have some things that create obstructions, and we're trying to get away from having to pull this set of head pipes off because there are several very grumpy bolts that have been in place for 25 years that hold this in to the cylinder head. Now, with earlier engines, the air-cooled stuff, the factory gave us studs in the cylinder head with nuts. Sometimes those would break, right? With this, they gave us bolts. And in most cases, those bolts break. But if we decide to pull that off, if we find out we have to, then I'm going to show everybody a couple tricks that are very unconventional and people would think that they just will not work, that should help us get at least a majority of those out without breaking them. Because who would ever think that to loosen a bolt, you should first try to tighten it?
Tighten them. Yeah.
So also on this side, we have the fuel pressure regulator right here. Not a bad part to change while we can get to it. It's also fairly easy to do in the car. It's a cheap thing to replace. And usually when they go bad, they run the fuel pressure way up. It's just not like, it's not one of those things where you have low fuel pressure because it fails, but usually it fails to the point where it stops the return of fuel back to the fuel tank and the engine gets so rich that it can't run. I've had that one happen to me in one of these cars. Back here, we have the heat exchanger, okay? So, Vu, what did you call that yesterday?
I thought it was a cooler.
Well, it is, but it's also a heater, okay? So, how can it be a cooler and a heater? Well, because it's designed to exchange heat. So, when these engines are cold, it is very difficult in colder weather for them to have a proper oil temperature when they're warming up. So the coolant gets a lot hotter
Quicker.
So what happens here, one side of this has coolant go through it, the other side of this has oil go through it. And the idea is that the oil is brought up to temperature faster by the coolant that is escalating in temperature quicker. Then When the engine is up to temperature and the thermostat's done its job and everything's happy, at that point, this turns into a cooler because it is there to take a temperature of the oil, which would normally try to elevate, and it keeps it in check, more along the lines of the coolant temperature.
So it's a two-way system.
Exactly. So in a way, your coolant thermostat is also an oil thermostat. So in air-cooled 911s, you have an oil thermostat because you have no coolant.
Right.
And if you didn't have that in cold weather, an air-cooled engine will basically never warm up if they don't have some means of a thermostat. You know, 356s use flaps to limit the airflow.
Right.
You know, to limit things. I mean, they had the portion that went over the cooling fan, things like that. There was different ways Porsche did this over the years, but all the air-cooled 911s had a thermostat in the block that regulated the oil going through things. So the idea with this is it helps the oil get to temperature faster when it's cold, and then it helps it to stay cooler when it's hot. Now, I will say that on the track, that doesn't work. And even in really high temperatures, ambient temperatures on the street, it also doesn't work. So we've had to come up with ways to add more heat exchange. Or in some cases, I even do a third radiator up front that's an oil cooler with another thermostat for track cars. But it's not uncommon to see coolant temperatures on the track be totally normal, you know, in the 200-degree range up to 220 and when it's hot. But the oil get to 270 or 280 because this does not have enough area.
Can't keep up.
And it can't keep up, and it can't exchange enough of the cool coolant with the hot oil to keep the hot oil at a cooler temperature. And the main reason for that is because you got all these valve springs, and the only thing that cools all these valve springs is the oil. And the harder you're running the engine, the more RPM you have, the harder the valve springs are working, the more heat they create, and the more friction because they're rubbing together. The engines that have dual valve springs, those springs are interference. They're rubbing together. They're creating friction. And the only thing that can cool them is the oil. So guess what happens to their heat? It goes into the oil.
Goes into the oil, yep.
So I will say these can fail. Sometimes, you know, most of the time when we had a car come in that had intermix, where you had oil in the coolant, coolant in the oil, almost every time this would be replaced because in other cars, this can be a point of failure that leads to that. So almost every time, this would be changed, and it would still have intermix. Usually somebody at that point has spent a couple, $3,000 because the shop did not realize what Y2K syndrome was. You know what that is? So happens mostly in year 2000 engines, or even 2001 cars, where the engine was built in 2000, where the cylinder head forms a crack. That can happen because the water pump failed and put some debris in there that got to the wrong spot in the head, or just because of a casting flaw in the cylinder head, mostly in 2000 models. So when that happened, it gave them intermix, but it did not have the typical cracked head syndrome. Typically in most cars that have a cracked head, you know, you'll end up with combustion gases in the coolant because it's cracked in the combustion chamber. These heads crack on the other side. So they crack in the valve cover area. There's no combustion there. So this messes with the diagnostician to the point they make the wrong decision and they say, well, let's change this. They fire what we call the parts cannon at it. It's easier to throw a part at it than it is to diagnose it or to get with a specialist that's seen that a few thousand times over the years. So they'll change this, clean the whole cooling system, think they've got it fixed, they crank it up. The first time it gets hot, they got intermix all over again. Then they call me.
Oof.
So that's kind of a common thing to change. And I will say a few of them have been bad over the years. Now, a Tiptronic car also has another one of these on the gearbox because they need to keep the transmission fluid cool, right? So I've seen one of those fail and also cause problems.
And where do those sit? Where do the...
On the side of the gearbox.
Oh, okay.
It's the same sort of cooler. Actually, with some of these cars, it's the exact same cooler. So here you have the starter. And now, Vu, at this point, this is where things get a little bit kind of unconventional. Because at a point, we would all think that a new part would be better than this old part, okay? But as a diagnostician and an engine builder, we learn that sometimes the old part has something the new one doesn't, and that is it's proven, okay? to me, a lot of times people will say, hey, I've got this problem on my starter or whatever, and I say, okay, did you change it? Yeah, it's a new part. In their mind, they think that the new part is flawless and perfect and it can't be the issue. In my world, I go to the new part first because it's the unproven part. In race engines before, I put old parts back in because they were proven parts versus the new ones. So today, in a post-COVID world, we're learning that some of the things that are built post-COVID or were built during COVID do not have the quality.
Right.
So one thing we've noticed is I've seen that with electronic stuff, motors, all that across the board. Pretty much no matter what car you're working on, even dirt bike stuff, whatever.
Right.
I've seen there's a degradation. In the V8 engine world, everybody's seen that as well. So here we have to make a decision. Yeah, you've got a starter that's been here for 25 years. Now, it would be real easy to change it right now. But we have to look and say the new one might not be as good as the old one. So my question to you is, did you have any symptoms when this thing, when you were driving the car before, where when you started it, as soon as it started and it self-sustained with combustion, did you ever hear like a squealing sound?
Nope.
Okay. Typically with these starters, when they start to fail, they'll make a "urk" sound as soon as you let off the
Like
key.
it stays on longer than your key.
A little bit, yeah. Well, that's kind of a grinding sound. This is actually because the way the Bendix and everything works and the way that the gears retract, the retraction happens and it makes a noise during the retraction. Now, I've seen people that had a starter that had that symptom. It's annoying, it's embarrassing because it makes an audible noise that people can hear 20 feet away. But I've seen that last for years that way. So if you have that noise or if you're slow to start, okay? Now, there's things that can cause it to be slow to start, like this, right? Connectors, all that sort of thing, key switches. There's all kinds of things that can make it slow to start. So we have to make our mind up, do you want to keep using what you got or do you want to put a new one there? And to me, the new one's not proven. So I'm not going to...
And I haven't had any issues.
And you haven't had any issues. Now, you just know that if you make the decision to stay this course, if you decide to change it later, you got to pull this and you got to fight with some stuff and the oil filter tube's in the way, and it's not an easy job.
Right.
But it's also not hard. I mean, DIY guys do that all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, one thing that I will say I've done before is, especially even on my own car, I'm like, okay, I don't want to change this right now. But when I do go to change it, I want to make sure these bolts aren't going to fight me.
So you might
So
crack
what am
them
I going to do? I'm going to take them out, I'm going to put anti-seize on them, and I'm going to put the bolts back in.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Okay? So you have to be thinking ahead. And all too often, people don't have the resource material. They haven't created that because they haven't paid attention, and they don't think ahead.
Wow. So that's pretty comprehensive walk around. You now know what we're going to attempt over the next 2 days. I also have in my hand here, while we're at it, I've got the motor mounts that I've already taken the bottom one out. Bottom nut takes 2 more bolts to come out, and I can replace the 2 rear motor mounts. And it's just while you're in there.
So you asked me yesterday, kind of what's the symptoms of that, if those are failing. And I said, well, it's kind of tougher with a 996 to know it. 997s because the proximity of the way the tailpipes are with the bumper. If you start to have one of those fail, you'll see it drop more on one of the other side or both of them together and you have a big gap. 996s, it's not as noticeable, but these are fluid filled. So a lot of times, especially in these Facebook groups, and it seems like the less informed owners are there, okay? and they will say, I have an oil leak. My engine's leaking oil. Where is this coming from? No, you have an engine mount leak. It's leaking out of this because it's fluid filled.
Right. So I definitely had, I've replaced the engine mounts that are in there currently because one day I walked out and there was a drop on one side and I smelled it, as most people do, and it didn't smell like engine oil, and it actually kind of smelled kind of gross.
Almost like power steering fluid.
Yeah.
It's really, it's
thick
got
and yeah, so there you go.
Yeah,
it out.
On your fingers, it feels like power steering fluid, but it's way thicker.
Yep, exactly. All right, well, there you have it. Next video, we'll start taking it all apart, putting it all back together. Watch the next one.